Welcome. We're going to talk about namespaces. This is an area of lots of contention, still under active research. We'll show you our current best guess at how it's going to look. This is joint work with Kyle Butt. It's nice to work with somebody so closely who can understand my pain at having a name that is useful for jokes and puns. Validator is a participant in the Casper protocol. So Casper, at least the version that we're using for our chain, this is one of Greg's asks, is that each validator needs to know who all the other validators are. So V is the set of validators. Now we assume a non-empty finite set R of regions. And just for concreteness, let's take R to be A, B, and C. So these are our three regions. There's a function from regions to the power set of validators. It picks out a non-empty subset of the validators for each region. So a validator could serve more than one region, but it has to serve at least one. Otherwise, it's not playing in the game, and we don't care. We say a validator inhabits a region X if it's in that subset. So regions get to set slashing criteria on the validators that inhabit them. We always want slashing for equivocation, that is, saying one thing to part of the network and one thing to somebody else. We also want to slash if they're doing illegal updates to the state of the system. So if they're changing their balance from 10 to 10 billion, right? We want to disallow that. Things that are not slashing criteria are performance, how fast you're responding to requests and so on. We do want to support ejection. So if everybody sees you as being slow, they can say, well, I saw him being slow, and someone else says, I saw him being slow. And when you get enough of that evidence together, is that, yeah, we all see you being slow, get out of here till you get your act together. We're not going to slash you and make you lose all your funds, but you're not going to play the game because you're slowing the rest of us down. Set of namespaces is the power set of the set of regions. So in this example, R is ABC. The power set has 8 elements. One of them is empty set. That's what we call the bottom region. Then there are, the bottom namespace. Then there are namespaces that correspond to exactly one region. So there's the namespace containing A, namespace containing B, namespace containing C. And then there are joins of regions. So we've got A join B, or you can think of it as the namespace A union the namespace, the namespace containing A union the namespace containing B, which is the namespace containing A and B. And then at the very top, we have the set ABC, and it has all of them. Now, each of these are effectively separate blockchains. So we have 8 blockchains with 3 regions. The validators for a particular namespace are the validators belonging to any of the regions in the namespace. Deploying code in a namespace with many joins will be more expensive since more validators have to validate the messages. It may also be slower or otherwise constrained since the criteria for inclusion of validator in other regions may be less strict. As we've said many times, all names are quoted processes. If P is a process, then at P or quote P is a name. Names created with new have the form at private, or unforgeable is probably a better word there, with a UID and an explicit namespace. So you can look at a process that was created with new and know what namespace it came from. The private word here, if you weren't in my last session, everything that's on the blockchain is public. Everybody can see what the values are. But the word private or unforgeable isn't part of the grammar of Rolang. So you can't write a program that creates this thing. In a similar way in Java, if you're given an integer, you can't turn it into the object living at that address in memory. You can know what the data is, but you can't construct it. You can't forge it. It is uncreatable. This slide is wrong. Quoted outputs live in the namespace of the name being sent on. So when we send on X, it has to migrate over to the namespace that X was created in order for it to run properly. Because anything that's listening on X will also be over there. Oh, this is, I'm sorry, that's a different question. Quoting. So when you quote a process, it lives in the namespace of all the free names in it. And so in this case, it's living in at least the namespace X. There's a question about whether Q should be included or not. In this proposal, it isn't. When we quote for, the namespace of Y and all the names in Q get included. So this gives us an easy way of establishing oh, there it is. Yeah. One more thing before I get there. If you do a par of two processes containing names, the namespace of the quoted parred process is the join of the two namespaces for each part of that. So this allows us to create in a very convenient way a way to talk between these blockchains. So as you can imagine, if you've got one blockchain that wants to send information over to another blockchain, there has to be this complicated atomic swap protocol going on where this code moves over to there. So if we've got namespace A and namespace B, before B is willing to accept a message from A, it has to be sure that A has reached a point where the message send can't be reverted. And so it's only willing to include the send on a name in B once that has completed. And then it's willing to include it in its blockchain. At the same time, A is only willing to get rid of the send until it is sure that the receive over here can't be rolled back. So there's this complicated finalization style process that has to happen between these two blockchains. And so if you have any communication that's going on between two blockchains, it's complicated and slow. So what you want to have happen is you only do that once to establish a common name where basically both of you are pushing up code into the join of your two namespaces, and then all of the communication between them happens quickly there. So we need something like the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, where I can send you something and you can send me something, we put it together, and we both end up with the same name that we can communicate on. And so if we've got little a in the namespace A and little b in the namespace B, we can par them together, quote it, and both end up with the same name where we can communicate in the namespace A join B. That's a third blockchain separate from those two. Mobility. This is what I was talking wrongly about earlier. For mobility, if I send on X, it's got to go to the namespace X because that's where all the contracts are listening. If I want to listen on X, I got to go to the namespace X because that's where all the data is being sent. And that's the complicated cross-chain process if you're sending on X in code that isn't already there. Joins between names that are not in the same namespace is a type error. As you can imagine, you don't want... you would have to wait for finalization on both chains to be sure that the data that you're pulling on and joining on is both bits of data are available. Let's see. Just to be clear what I mean by a join. This is a different thing from joins of namespaces. So if I say for A from X semicolon B from Y, then do Q. If X and Y are in different namespaces, this is waiting for common state between two different blockchains, and that's ugly and annoying. So we just outright prohibit it. Bundle. This is a really cool thing that I think Kyle came up with. You can't pattern match on the interior of a bundled process. So bundle lets you combine things together and then prohibit them from being disassembled. An arbitrary process, you can put it together and then you have the authority to disassemble it using the match keyword. When you have a bundled process, that authority has been revoked. So now you can only match it as a blob. You can't look inside and see what it's doing. This is important because you want to be able to send code to somebody else to evaluate without them being able to take it apart and get at the unforgeable names that you created that are inside it that they shouldn't have access to. Processes maintain 2 bits for whether you can send or receive on the corresponding name. And bundling lets you mask off those bits. So if I want to create a contract and have it be something that only I can receive messages for, I need to use something like this. If I say contract at, quote, hello world, anybody can write the same thing. And so we would all be contending for messages sent here. But if I want to be the only guy serving this up, the only guy running something at pyrofex.net on the blockchain, I don't want other people intercepting messages intended for me. So what I can do is listen on the read-only version and distribute the write-only version to other people. Bundling works excellently for that, for unforgeable names, something that I create and then hand out only the sendable part, and I'm the only one that can listen. Doesn't work so well for forgeable names, that is, things that you can just construct out of ground types, because even if I hand them the write-only version, they can just explicitly type that again and get the full-powered version. So in order to use public names in a way that reflects these desires, what you do is you send the public name to a registry, and you can say, give me the write-only name that corresponds to this string. And so I can send pyrofex.net as a string to the registry, look up the name I should be sending on, which is unforgeable, and then send as many messages as I want. And then the pyrofex.net contract maintains the read-only version of that name, and it's the only one that can receive those messages. At the same time, if the pyrofex.net domain name ever changed hands, somebody else would want to replace that contract with their own, so they get to interact with the registry, prove that they have ownership of the domain name, and change which name gets returned from the registry. But these, all of that is supported by using the bundle keyword. Ground terms of the form row : can be registered. I just mentioned that. So we've got the DNS record that I mentioned. You can also register a public key. It will issue a challenge. You sign it, send it back. It verifies that the public key validates that signature and then lets you register a read-only or write-only key in that position. Similarly, if you provide a pre-image, that is, if you have a contract, you hash it and then go claim the hash, you can say, I've got the contract that hashes to this value, so I get to put something in the registry at that spot. Blessed contracts. Rev contract, the registry, Casper contracts for bonding, unbonding, slashing, distribution will be blessed contracts. They run without needing funds. These are the things that are necessary for the system to work at all, therefore we're not going to charge for them. When a validator bonds, unbonds, or is slashed, every validator needs to know about it. So it's possible that it doesn't necessarily need to happen at the top namespace, but it needs to happen high enough that a coalition in a single namespace can't prevent it. Doing all of that stuff at top is the simplest way. It's what we're currently considering. That's the end of what I've got to say about namespaces. Kyle has a whole bunch more that he's going to talk about with the outstanding problems that we're dealing with, issues with Casper. Again, this is something that is very deeply in flux and still a matter of research. Would you like the one?
Oh, no. So one of the things that that we're coming to realize is that if you have disjoint validator sets for regions, and you make it very easy to start up a new region, then like if you have code mobility, you have to have some mechanism for making sure that code that ran while you weren't watching followed all the rules of the machine, because otherwise, like somebody could do something, the obvious attack of transferring some funds over behind the curtain, making the value grow, and then bringing them back from behind the curtain. So one of the ways that you could, so it seems to me that in essence, if you want to trust what's happening everywhere in the blockchain, you have to watch everything that's happening somewhere in the blockchain. And I'm not even convinced that this is avoidable, right? Like most of the existing blockchains, this is a property that exists, and the thing that people do is that they people don't notice because mostly they don't process enough transaction volume to where it would be an issue. One of the things that you could do is have a fairly high barrier to entry for creating a new region, and although like one of the things that we want is to make things democratic and let anybody come by and join. When you create a new region, you're imposing a cost on the existing validators because that's more that they have to watch to make sure that the rules are all being followed. In the limit, one of the things that you could do is you could make just a single global namespace, and you have your organization. So within an organization, you have a very large node that may be distributed, multi-homed across country, or like many machines interact, and you trust your other machines because they're yours, and you could split the as transactions come in, you can split them among yourselves because you trust you, and then you verify. Similarly, when you get blocks from other places on the network, you could shard it out, and you take advantage of rolling to do a local sharding rather than a global one. We have. Do you want me to draw the tree on the whiteboard? One of the other things that we've considered is, and it may be possible to enforce something similar to this with the namespace proposal that Mike just showed you, but these are the old expos, the ones you have to hold far away so you don't pass out. So one of the things that we thought about was, instead of doing the full lattice, take a spanning tree of the lattice. And you would organize things slightly differently within this tree. So in essence, all rev balances...
Sorry, I just wanted to make one more point. In the past and on various of the RChain Hangouts, we've talked about namespaces and behavioral types and that sort of thing. In this talk, we're only discussing how to break up the network into small enough pieces and the namespaces that are relevant to that. In general, a namespace is a collection of names. You can define collections of names by the structure of the process they're quoting. In Venus, we'll be able to define collections of names by their behaviors. But in this talk, when we say namespace, we're only referring to collections of names that are organized in some geographic or organizational way, not necessarily anything to do with the underlying code of that name.
So one of the ways that you could do this is with a reserves. We'll call this a reserve model. So in essence, so all rev is rev at the top, or you think of this as your Federal Reserve or your gold vault or whatever you want. In order to create rev in a lower namespace in the tree, you would have to basically lock some amount of rev, and and then that would allow you to produce exactly that amount of rev and spread it out within that tree, and then you would do the same thing. So then, in order to transfer funds from here to there, you'd redeem some amount of rev here, and then that amount of rev would also be redeemable here, and then you could take it and you would lock it up in this treasury and push it down, and then lock it up in this treasury right here and push it down, and then you can put it. Then you have two purses in the same namespace, and you could join them. This avoids the problem of having to watch all the transactions in all of the namespaces, because as long as right, like if I'm here, right, if I'm validating here and I'm either validating in the top or I trust the top, I only have to either validate or trust this chain, because right, like even if there's something wonky in here, I know that nothing. Right, even if money is stolen here, I know that no money has been printed there, and that's one of the things that we want to. Is it really windy outside? So, and it's possible that we could make something like this conservation model work in the complete lattice. But at the moment, I haven't figured out how. There you go.
I'm not exactly sure how the coin purse mechanism works, but assuming that the bottom nodes were, well, actually, let me take that, forget what I just said. Is there a way to sort of pre-allocate some spendable crypto, say, in a coin purse that would allow you to transact business without a network being present? So more or less like a pre-authorization, almost like a pre-authorization for a certain amount of crypto.
I don't know that that's germane to the namespace discussion, but in order to verify things like double spend, you have to be online.
The blockchain, just by the way it's constructed, is an online thing. Just to reiterate what Kyle said, if I know here that there are $10 here and $20 there, it may be that there's some bully that steals the $10 from someone else who has it in this thing. But in order for him to get those $10 out, he's got to go through me. And so I am only allowing $10 out of this thing ever. Right? It's not as though he can cheat and turn that into $100 and walk out with it. It's just who's got it can change. But I don't care because I'm just keeping track of how much money is in each neighborhood.
So you're keeping track of how much money is in each neighborhood. What's your role then? Are you a validator, or are you just an R-chain node?
So again, this is an alternative proposal to the one that I presented. They're somewhat orthogonal. We could do both. It's still up in the air whether that one works at all. We think this one works, but it doesn't have a bunch of the properties that Greg wanted. You need explicit routing. So if I want to send money from here to here, I've got to go through this node, and that means I have to keep track of what my relationship is in the tree to everybody else. That was one of the things Greg hoped to avoid. So if you're here and you want to transfer to there, yes, it would have to go to the top and then back down.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. If instead of having a single tree, which may be organized geographically, we may want to superpose lots of trees and get a DAG, and then you can choose any path through any of those trees to get there. But then again, it's explicit routing, which was something we had hoped to avoid.
Yeah, you would need a common ancestor. One thing you could do, like, is if it may be advantageous to have some funds in all of them.
Yeah.
Right, like, and then you only really need to take the round trip if
if one of your banks runs out of money.
Yeah, if you need to consolidate.
Vlad has lots of strong opinions on this. If you talk to him, he will happily speak to you for weeks on end about these things. They don't happen to his opinions don't happen to line up with Greg's desiderata, so we haven't just outright accepted them yet. Go ahead.
Mike, Kyle, could we walk back to a very basic question? What does a validator do? Under what circumstances does a validator get slashed? Is a validator making personal decisions? Is he just running code?
In a proof-of-stake network, the only security you have is what misbehaviors you can detect other validators committing. So the point of a validator is to watch every other validator and make sure they don't do anything illegal. There are two different things that you can be watching for. And one of them is that the Casper protocol is followed properly. That is, you're not claiming to have seen one thing to part of the network and claiming to have seen something else to another part of the network, trying to double spend, that sort of thing. It's what Vlad calls equivocation. The other part is verifying that all of the validators, when they are issuing new blocks, are only making valid transitions of the state function. So if I'm starting from this program state, validating that I actually can get to the subsequent program state by valid reduction rules. That second portion, we may want to split off. That was one of the proposals that Kyle mentioned, was that you can have a watcher who doesn't care anything about Casper. All he's doing is looking at the block and its immediate parents and verifying that, yep, each of these is a valid way of getting from there to here. So sometimes we call those read-only nodes, but they're watching everything that's going on, or at least the part of the network that they care about, because that's the only part they're going to communicate with. In this model, you don't necessarily need to know who all the validators are. Each one of these is an independent blockchain, and then these sorts of interactions where you're pushing things up and down are ones where you're doing finalization between the two blockchains and atomic swap style stuff. It allows you to, for instance, if there is a coalition here and it forks into one part and another, whether that's malicious or not, like Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, there's just some disagreement and they fork. This allows you to have each part publish its own new genesis block to a parent and then continue operating in the same tree. And so Bitcoin is no longer exchangeable directly for Bitcoin Cash, but we can set up an exchange rate and continue interacting and maintain that economic value. But again, it requires explicit routing, which makes your contracts more brittle in the face of network changes. Any other questions?
Guess I'm doomed to talk on the mic since I chased everyone with the mic earlier. So is this a different way of defining and explaining how regions and how namespaces, and there's a type of space, namespace, it's a region and others, or like inside of these circles, well, that would be an entire namespace and that would have a whole body of validators, could be 3 million, whatever. I'm just trying to map that to some other concepts around namespace.
Sure. Again, namespaces are just ways of defining collections of names. In this case, you'd have names in here where it's got some hierarchy. You can pick the root you're starting from and say rightchild.x or something. If you've got a geographic hierarchy, you can say May West or
World, Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, something like that.
Yeah.
And if you allow them to overlap, you can be nearby in an organizational sense, right? You have some organizational tree, and you're nearby in that organizational tree. You're also joined in the world tree, and you may be far away, like New York to LA. But like you have your own private backbone, and so like if you're communicating with your same organization, it's still cheap.
Yeah. you could have federal offices in every state, but the IRS gets to exchange things in its own network, no matter what state they're in, versus the IRS communicating with the local tax authority in the state they're in, and that would use the geographic tree. So both organizational geographic trees give you different ways of routing this stuff, but you are doing explicit routing. So when we talked about this to Greg, he was like, no, that's nothing like what I had in mind, and so he came up with something like this. This is independent of that. We can do both of them if we wanted to. Question is, how much do we need to get done? Is it even possible to do this thing without watchers covering the whole network? These are the kinds of questions that we're still dealing with.
With respect to developing nations, let's take Jamaica for example, right? And I'm writing an application that ensures that, you know, when a police officer writes a report, it's unchanging, right? So I have a bunch of validators set up throughout the island. The network isn't very good, right? So for whatever reason, it's slower than everything else, every other network running in the world. How do you reconcile making sure that validator in Jamaica stays alive?
If the government comes in and just seizes the device and uses it to mine their own cryptocurrency, there's not a lot you can do. As far as making sure it continues to interact with the rest of the network, in this model that we've proposed, the criteria for being in a joined namespace is the infimum of the criteria for being in any of the component namespaces. So if Mae West is talking to Jamaica, it can't expect the performance to be the same there. It's got to admit that these are slow, therefore everything that I do with that network is going to be slow. So you're not going to get ejected for just being in the region with those performance criteria if you join with another one. Any more questions? Okay, well, go have some snacks and see you guys later.